Okay, welcome to this video on how to answer questions 2A and 2B for the Edexcel Medicine Through Time. So those are the how useful are sources A and B, and then also how could you follow up a source to find out more, and I'll show you that in a second. So let's start with the ingredients then for question 2A. Okay, so for this source you need to be, sorry, for this question you need to do two copes. So that is a structure. Never compare the sources. There's no requirement by the exam. And always say the sources are useful. Okay, never say a source is not useful. The reason why is they always will give you sources which are somewhat useful at the very least. Okay, so they don't want to see you saying, the question doesn't say is the source useful, it says how useful is it. So a COPE stands for content, own knowledge, provenance, and evaluate. So for content, you want to pick out a quote, if it's a written source, or if it's an image source, you want to pick out what you can see and then link that back to the question. For O stands for own knowledge. So then link the source back to your own knowledge. If it matches, that means the source is useful. Provenance, have a look at the caption and then think about the 5 W's. So who, what, where, when, why. You do not need to do all of them. You only need to consider one or two of them. And then think about whether that makes the source useful or not. And then finally, evaluate. So say how useful the source is overall, but remember to put a word in front of useful to signify how useful. So you might say partly useful, somewhat useful, very useful, and so on. Again, here's the mind map I will be using. If you haven't already, I would either ask me for a copy of that or just take a screenshot of this page so you've got it for your notes. Okay, so this is the question I'm going to be looking at. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the effects of a gas attack? And here are my sources. Pause the video now and have a read through the sources before I do, because I've already read through the sources very briefly. So I'm going to just jump straight into planning, okay? Also pause for this source as well. Okay, so we'll start with the written source then. So the first thing I'm going to be thinking about is I'm going to be thinking about the fact that it's asking me about the effects of a gas attack. So in the exam, the first thing I would do is when I see the question, I would always highlight the words after inquiry into. Whatever's after that, you underline like so, okay? So we are looking at the effects of a gas attack. So when we have a look at this source now, we'll be on the lookout for that. Okay, so we have got, right, let me just remind myself of the source. Okay. Okay, so what I might talk about for this one then is I might pick out this quote. So I might say, he coughed up a thick stream of discolored phlegm. He was too busy struggling to breathe. Okay, and that proves to me the fact that the effects of gas are suffocation and panicking as well. So the fact that we talked about to bother much about anything else, okay? So it has a psychological impact as well. My own knowledge, so I would then use my own knowledge and I want to look at this part here, so the types of gas. So I then talk about the fact that one of the key symptoms of gas, specifically phosgene and chlorine gas, was suffocation, okay? So I would talk about here, phosgene and chlorine gas. Sorry, wrong one. Phosgene. Sorry, key symptom is suffocation. And then I believe it's mustard gas that is. It would cause blistering in the affected areas. Okay, something like that. Then I need to consider the provenance of the source. So for that, I'm going to be thinking about the caption. So that's a diary account by Dr. Harvey Cushing. Cushing worked as a surgeon on the Western Front. If you can, you always want to think about one reason why it's very useful, one reason why it's not fully useful. Remember, we never say the source is not fully useful. We might say that the provenance is limited in its utility, okay? So the good things about this provenance is that it is before the introduction of gas masks. And it is created by a man with medical knowledge. Never say first-hand experience. That is pointless, okay? Never say that. However, there is one bad thing about this source. The fact that it's created by Cushing. He is a brain surgeon, not a gas expert. Now, even if you didn't know that Cushing was a brain surgeon, the fact that it says Cushing worked as a surgeon means you could talk about it. So the fact that there is one part which is not useful, or not fully useful, I should say, rather, that means the source is going to be partly useful overall. Still, see how I'm still saying it's partly useful. I'm not saying it's not useful. Okay, so then for the next source, I want to talk about the fact that I can see men with bandages in their eyes. And then I'm going to link that to the fact that chlorine gas and phosgene could blind a person. Okay. Let me just double check my choice of gassing. All right. Okay, cool. My own knowledge then. Sorry, that bit's meant to go on my own knowledge. What am I doing? So here I talk about the fact that the effects were inability to see and the fact that they are together. Okay. Right. And then in terms of provenance, the fact that it is an ADS, so that is where we want to talk about here for the advanced stress indication, we want to talk about the fact that that often could not deal with the number of casualties. So it's the second link in the chain of evacuation. So it's often overwhelmed by casualties. It's also after 1918. So it's yeah, so after 1918 shows the impact of gas after gas masks. You could talk about the fact that it's a photograph, the fact that they are going to receive treatment, but that it might have been kind of not staged, but it might have been choreographed. But the fact that they all look in quite a lot of pain would suggest otherwise. So overall, this source is going to be very useful because there isn't really any limiting factor in terms of it. Okay. So that's what we would say in terms of the provenance for this source. And then this is what it should look like when you're writing it up. So I would start by saying then source A is partly useful. So source A is a written source. So source A is partly useful for an inquiry into the effects of gas. The source tells us that gas had that a man suffering from gas. I'll just copy and paste my quote. Gas coughed up a thick stream of discolored phlegm. He was too busy struggling to breathe. This shows us that gas prevented men from breathing normally, which have physical and psychological effects. Remember the question is saying how useful is it into the effects of a gas attack? Okay. Then I'll say from my this matches my own knowledge, as I know that mustard gas caused blistering on the skin, and if it affected the throat, this blistering could occur internally, preventing a person to breathe. Okay. So the fact that it matches my own knowledge, the fact that it matches my own knowledge, my knowledge makes the source further useful. In addition, the source was created by a person with medical experience who was operating on the front line before the introduction of gas masks in late 1915, early 1916, which suggests that he would have had direct experience with gas attack victims, making the source more useful. However, it was written by Cushing, who was a brain surgeon, not an expert in dealing with gas attacks, which makes the source less useful. Notice how I'm still saying it's still useful, just a little bit less. So overall, given the source matches my own knowledge and is partly helpful due to its provenance, sorry, partly reliable due to its provenance. The source can be seen as partly useful. Okay. Notice how I'm not mentioning source B at all. That's going to be a separate paragraph. Okay. So basically, my content is in red. My own knowledge is then in green. My provenance is then in purple. And then at the end, my overall evaluation judgment, where I say how far, is in yellow. Okay. So now let me do the other one. So I then say source B is very useful. I didn't say source B on the other hand is very useful. I said source B is very useful for an inquiry into the effects of gas attacks. The source shows us men who are blindfolded with bandaging, with temporary bandaging, suggesting that gas has affected their eyesight. This matches my own knowledge, as I know that chlorine gas and phosgene both had the potential to cause temporary blindness in soldiers due to the mix of chemicals, due to the effect of chemicals humans on human skin. Okay. Which reinforces what I can see in source B, making it useful. Then we'll say the source was a photograph of men in an advanced dressing station, which is the second link in the chain of evacuation, and therefore panic and chaos in source B will be reinforced by can be understood. The panic and chaos in source B is typical. Is typical of the experience of medical officers. Furthermore, as this is a photograph, it enables us to see the physical. In fact, I'll talk about the fact that they're also crowded together. So, as a photograph enables us to see the physical and psychological, to see for ourselves. Yes. Therefore, due to the source's content matching my own knowledge, source having a very useful provenance, it can be seen very useful. Okay, so here is basically my content. Green own knowledge, provenance is in purple, and then in yellow is my overall evaluation. Okay, so that's basically how you do that. That's what an 8 out of 8 looks like for sources. Then the question that you get afterwards is how could you follow up source A to find out more about the effects of a gas attack? So I'll just briefly talk through that. This question can be quite tricky if you don't actually know how to do it. So when it asks you to pick out a detail in source A that you would follow up, you want to pick out a quote that is relevant to the topic in the question. Now, the topic in the question is the effects of a gas attack, not the reasons why gas was used, not the efficiency of gas, but the effects of gas. Okay, so source A, if we remind ourselves, is this one. So if we were picking out a quote from this, we want to think about something to do with the effects of gas attack. So we might say, so it says a most horrible form of death. Okay. So we might put down for our quote here, because that's about talking about the effects of gas. So a most horrible form of death. You could also have talked about the quote beforehand. So talking about the, oh, hang on, sorry. You could have also talked about the quote beforehand. So talking about where it says, struggling to breathe, to bother much about anything else, a most horrible form of death. In fact, that might be a better. Oh, great, I can't change it. Okay, that's fine. We'll just go with that. So then the question that we'd ask then from this is, it has to be a question that is relevant, and this is the hard part, to both the quote and the topic. Now, the topic is the effects of a gas attack. The quote is the one I've picked, so most horrible form of death. So we have to ask a question which is about the effects of a gas attack and is linked to that quote. So the question I might ask is, how many men died from suffocation caused by gas? How many men died from suffocation caused by gas? Now, notice how that is both linked to my quote, so most horrible form of death. I'm talking about how many men died, but it's also linked to what's in the question. Okay, so I'm talking about the people dying is an effect of a gas attack. Now, the source that we use, we always use the same source, which is RAMC medical records. And then my explanation is always going to be quite similar. So the reason why they're helpful, so we just give a brief explanation, is because it contains details of gas attack victims and would have recorded the number of deaths and the circumstances in which they died. But in the exam, don't use etc. like I've done there. That's just me just basically, I don't need that part. But that's essentially how you go about answering that. Okay, so just a brief explanation at the bottom. Now, what I would suggest that you do is you have a go at practicing some of these sources by yourself. The source question is one of the hardest questions, if not the hardest on the paper. So why don't you pause the video and have a go with this question? So ignore those, just pause it, and yeah, you should be able to read. I know that my words on the screen. And then when you've done that, have a go at that. So let me get rid of these for you. Okay. So that's that, and then that's that. Right, I hope you found that helpful, and I'll see you all in the next video.